Great, thank you. Welcome, everyone. I'm going to turn it over to Terry Schmidt right away to welcome us to the program.
Welcome to everyone for tonight's Catalyst Endowment Fund program. I'd like to welcome all of our members who probably are eagerly looking forward to tonight's presentation, and any guests who I am assuming are also eagerly awaiting what we do here at Catalyst with the Catalyst Fund. We really appreciate the support of each and every member, not just the support financially when they join the Catalyst Fund, but their eager support intellectually and emotionally to support the efforts that we do to learn more about our city and our region and about particular problems, and more specifically about what we as an endowment fund, as our Catalyst Endowment Fund, can do to address some of those problems. I do want to point out that this meeting is being recorded, and that may matter to some of us. If it does, you obviously can stop your video and mute yourself, and your name may still appear, but you can change the name too. But at any rate, be aware that this is being recorded. Most of us understand that the Catalyst Fund is a giving circle. It's one of 3 giving circles that the Hartford Foundation supports. It is one that has quite a number of years behind it. I believe we're done 25 or more years with the Catalyst Endowment Fund. People pool their money. It goes to the Hartford Foundation, where they manage it really well. And every year we then take some of that money and give it to one or more nonprofit organizations after we have studied a problem and listened to presentations by various nonprofits as to how they are addressing the problem that we've studied over the year. So we come together several times during the year to learn, to explore, and then ultimately in October we decide. We will get together in October and decide which nonprofit or nonprofits we will be donating our money to this year. We will have about $60,000 to donate this year, and the staff of the Catalyst Endowment from the Hartford Foundation is busily now sending out the announcements that are inviting nonprofit organizations to consider applying to the Catalyst Endowment Fund for consideration. So our study topic this year, which we decided 8 or 9 months ago, was the historic roots of inequitable housing policies and what we might do to address them. On our April 9th program, we got together with Erin Boggs, who is from the Open Communities Alliance, and Anika Singh Lamar, who is a professor at Yale Law School. They discussed the laws and the history of housing discrimination, the zoning regulations and the laws that have created the situation in which some people are fairly openly discriminated against and have historically been discriminated against, sometimes straightforwardly legally discriminated against. And they told us a little bit about how we got there. We will be looking tonight to a presentation about where we are and what some people are doing about it. And then we move on in October to where we will be making a decision about how we are going to address it. I do want to underscore for everyone here something that I suspect everybody knows in their hearts, but I just want to say it out loud. We've been hearing for at least a year, probably a lot more, about the issues of systemic racism. I don't know how many of us have gotten into conversations with other people who said, well, I don't really understand it, or other people who say, I understand it, but I don't know what to do about it. Catalyst Endowment Fund is precisely addressing both of those issues. We're trying to understand systemic racism, and more importantly, we're trying to do something about it. And I think that's exciting. I am thrilled to be a part of this. I feel very privileged to be a part of this, and especially with tonight's guests. So let me get on to tonight. You don't need to listen to me. We have really important, wonderful people to listen to tonight. And so let me quickly introduce who we have making a presentation for us tonight. Erica Frank is with us. Erica, I don't know if given the order of things, I don't know if you wave, everybody will be able to see you, but if you wave, that's a good idea. Erica is a senior community impact office at the Hartford Foundation. So she's one of our own. She's been a point person for grant making around community and economic development, including extensive work around housing. So where the rubber meets the road, you'll find Erica. Sarah Bronin is an attorney. She is an architect. She is a policymaker. Sarah, it sounds like you can't make up your mind. She is also, more importantly, the founder of Desegregate Connecticut, and she and her team have developed some groundbreaking Connecticut zoning atlas as a resource. She has brought along with her tonight one of her people, part of her organization, Nick Abbott, who is a Harvard law student, and he will have things to present as well from a legal perspective. And finally, last but by far certainly not least, a guy that I know and have walked with and feel very positive about in another one of the many ways to address systemic racism, AJ Johnson. AJ Johnson is the pastor of the Urban Hope Refuge Church. He's a community organizer. Thank you for waving, AJ. He's a community organizer for the Center for Leadership and Justice. He is very active in something called GIA, which is trying to put together congregations of many religions in our region and empower them to participate in social justice activities. He is well known in leading the community in the fight against neglectful property owners, known as by the hashtag No More Slumlords campaign. So I welcome all of our guests. I am thrilled that we will be able to hear from each one of them. And I am turning this over to them to introduce themselves. And I think we're going to go Erica, Sarah, Nick, and AJ for a couple minutes each. Do an introduction of yourselves, please.
Excellent, thank you. So I'll be very quick, but as Terry said, my name is Erica Frank, and I'm a Senior Community Impact Officer here at the Foundation, leading our Higher Opportunity Neighborhoods grant portfolio, but also helping to administer HFPG Impact, which is our impact investing subsidiary. I'm very happy to be with you this evening and really applaud Catalyst Fund members for choosing to learn more and to take action on such a complex but important topic. I don't think we can possibly overstate how much a safe, stable, and affordable home means to all other aspects of success in a person's life. So I'll be moderating tonight's panel, which I hope will highlight the knowledge and depth of experience of our three panelists, but I'll also be sharing a bit about the Hartford Foundation strategies to support increased housing quality, mobility, and stability. And with that, I'll turn it over to Sarah.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much to the Hartford Foundation for sponsoring this important conversation and for pivoting its philanthropy to focus on issues that are really important to the Hartford region and seeing them as interconnected. So I'm Sarah. I am a law professor incoming at Cornell and planning professor. And for the last year, I've had the privilege of leading this Desegregate Connecticut Coalition, which has involved the Hartford Foundation, as well as Pastor Johnson's organization and 70 other groups that have come together, seeing housing and seeing advocacy for housing as really an issue that's central to the inequality that we see in our region. Our perspective from our coalition is that zoning is one of the many, many issues that we must tackle. And so that's kind of a very brief overview as to why I'm here and why I'm so grateful to the Foundation for convening this conversation. Thanks.
I'll briefly jump in to say I'm Nick Abbott. I am the Deputy Coordinator at Desegregate Connecticut, currently a law student. Have been involved with the group for the past year. I want to echo what Sarah said, really grateful for the Foundation's support and for the Catalyst Endowment Fund for having this important conversation. Happy to be here and looking forward to the conversation.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Pastor AJ Johnson. I'm the Senior Pastor of Urban Hope Refuge Church on the corner of Westland and Barber Street in North Hartford. I'm also a community organizer with the Center for Leadership and Justice. which helped organize and create the Greater Hartford Interfaith Action Alliance. And I'm excited to be here to have this conversation because over the last couple of years, I've been deeply engaged in housing issues as it pertains to residents from the resident perspective, but not only the resident perspective, but also leading, like taking that conversation into policy. And I think this is a wonderful opportunity to share with each other what's happening on the ground, but how policy can affect the lives of everyday people. So I'm excited to be here. Thank you guys so much for picking little old me from the corner of Westland and Barber Street to be here and have this conversation with you. Thank you.
Excellent. Terry, you want me to take it away and get into our panel discussion? Great.
Yep, go for it, Erica.
Excellent. Well, thank you to all of our panelists for the introductions. Just to quickly open us up, I just want to give a brief overview of what we hope our conversation will cover today. We know that Catalyst has heard from other speakers that have shared a little bit more about the long history of federal and state policies that have systemically segregated our communities over decades. But today our panelists are really going to talk about the current state of housing policy in Connecticut from their perspectives. They have unique vantage points to share the ongoing effects of systemic racism by sharing resident stories, but also looking at the data that shows what housing is allowed and where. So we'll need to understand the current state of housing policy and its impacts, but we do want to spend the majority of the conversation talking about solutions. Both the pastor and Ms. Bronin and Nick have led effective strategies to address the issues of housing quality and housing segregation in Connecticut, though we know there's more to do. So I am going to start by sharing a little bit about the role the Hartford Foundation has been playing in the housing space more broadly, and then we'll get right into the heart of soul of the evening, which is our panelists' conversation. So we know, and excuse me, but there is I don't know about you all, but there's a storm that's got picked up pretty swiftly outside my window. But we know that ensuring that all residents have access to high quality housing in high opportunity neighborhoods is critical to all of the other goals that we have in our strategic plan as a foundation. Without housing as a backbone, our work in education, community safety, and employment is much less effective. And you'll notice that our work in housing rarely includes funding housing development ourselves. There are some unique circumstances, such as through our impact investing, where we do make these investments. But the reality is that even as large of a community foundation as we are, we do not have the funds ourselves to address the housing crisis, both the needs that exist in our urban and suburban areas. So instead, our housing strategy looks at funding research, evaluation, the capacity of residents and nonprofits, many of which are here before you, policy and advocacy, education and organizing, all focused on making systemic changes at multiple levels that we predict will lead to better outcomes. So we generally break down our housing strategies in a few ways, but looking at increased housing quality, increased housing choice, and increased housing stability. And so I'll just share a little bit about the work that we're doing in each of those areas. So our work in increasing the quality of housing certainly includes support for resident organizing efforts, particularly those that the pastor will discuss today, but we're also supporting projects that seek to address the health components of poor quality housing. In particular, I want to spotlight LISC's Building for Health initiative, which brings together supports that are addressing lead abatement, asthma triggers, energy efficiency, and others. So for example, when Eversource is going into properties to do an energy audit, we're hopefully training them to also assess the house for health factors and making warm referrals to services at hospitals, municipalities, and nonprofits to make those repairs and ultimately improve health outcomes of residents. We'll hear a lot today about the policies that keep people out of suburban communities. And while it's certainly important for us to increase that opportunity for mobility, we also know that we need to be investing in urban opportunity as well, which is why a focus on housing quality is so critical. But we do also support organizations working to increase housing mobility. So while not everyone wants to move to suburban or rural communities, they should have that choice. Here we've made investments in research and organizing and policy work, including the work of Desegregate Connecticut, which Sarah will discuss today. We believe the legislative change needed to open up communities will happen when residents in suburban municipalities are educated and organized. And to that end, we released an RFP last year, really focused on resident education and organizing around housing segregation. We've since made several grants which help residents learn about the history of segregation in their community, about zoning, their own town zoning codes, and it also provides capacity building for towns that are ready to make changes. And then finally, though it won't be the focus of our discussion today, we're heavily invested in ensuring housing stability through eviction prevention. We know eviction impacts physical and mental health, child's attendance and education, employment outcomes, the list goes on. And we've definitely been urgently following the potential eviction crisis, and it's been a large focus of our advocacy efforts. However, we are also partnering to augment the capacity of legal aid organizations, supporting shelter diversion, and of course, wraparound services to augment the rental assistance that's being provided through federal recovery dollars. So I'm not able to share the full scope of our work in this overview, but I think this is an area that I hope exemplifies the Foundation's new way of operating. We're squarely focused on addressing racial inequities that exist in housing. We're looking at funding not only high-level policy changes, but also the capacity for residents in all communities to learn, engage, and take action in this space. And we're trying to lift up evidence-based practices and use of data in the work that we fund. So I'm hoping that this helps give some ideas on how philanthropy can help make a difference as you all consider your grant making this year, but also as you consider the information you're about to hear from our panelists. And so with that, I'd actually like to turn this conversation more towards the panelists that we've invited here today to talk about their work, what they're learning, and what they can share with us. So thank you, all three of you, for being here tonight. And my first question is going to go to Pastor Johnson to open us up and hopefully set the stage for this important conversation. So Pastor, I know through your work with the Center for Leadership and Justice, you and other organizers have been able to lift up and amplify the voices of many Hartford residents, primarily people of color, that have experienced some very poor living conditions in Hartford for years. You've also been successful in bringing out some tangible changes as a result of your efforts. Just hoping you can talk a little bit more about the No More Slumlords campaign and what you've been able to accomplish so far.
Yes, thank you so much, Erica. And again, thank you to the Catalyst Fund. Thank you to Jay Williams, Michael, all the great people here. And to this amazing panel with Sarah Bronin and this guy from Harvard. I feel like I'm in good company, right? So I also want to give a shout out to some folks that are actually in the room, man. Shout out to Janice Fleming, Ann Stanback, all these amazing people, Deborah Rothstein, which I owe you a phone call. I'll give you a call, don't worry about it. Donna Macchiao, all these great folks that are here. It's good to see familiar friends in here with us to have this conversation. I want to say, under the leadership of Corey Mackey, our executive director at the Center for Leadership and Justice, our mission is to develop leaders who act collectively for social justice in Greater Hartford. And we do this by having something called the Golden Rule, right? The Golden Rule. And most of you think the Golden Rule is, what do you think the Golden Rule is, right? Treat others the way you want to be treated, right? That's not what I'm talking about tonight. Our Golden Rule and principle in community organizing is never, ever do for others what they can do for themselves. I'll say it again, just in case people are taking notes, because I'm spitting some hot fire right here, okay? Never, ever do for others what they can do for themselves. And what we have learned is in the city of Hartford and other places like Hartford, that we have organizations that take capacity from people, right? And say that we're doing good work and we're changing things, but we never really equip the people that we're serving to go and fight for themselves, right? And so what we do at the Center for Leadership and Justice is we take the opportunity to lead people and to make them the content professional, make them the leaders of their own experience, right? And give them the tools so when they're no longer with us, they know how to organize themselves, their friends, their loved ones, and it's like a gift that keeps on giving. And so through organizing like that, we came across a housing campaign, right? And we're not content professionals in housing. We're not, Yale graduates or Harvard graduates from, with all these great degrees. We're just organizers who have walked through some of the most deplorable conditions in some apartments in our city. And just really quickly, I think this video will share a little more of the conversation that we're going to have tonight. This is Lester Holtz on Nightly News, just explaining some of the things that we have experienced in Hartford. I'm going to play it, and I might stop it a little early because it might be a little lengthy, but I at least want to share.
Revealing that under the Trump administration and HUD Secretary Ben Carson, the number of families living in squalid conditions in federally subsidized housing has risen significantly, while landlords pocket millions in taxpayer money. Here's Stephanie Goss.
The rain's coming from the roof down through here, dripping and into these buckets.
These walls are the only thing standing between Walter Thomas, his wife Sarah, and homelessness. But the entire apartment complex in Hartford, Connecticut is falling apart, leaving families to deal with mold, roaches, rodents, even a collapsed ceiling. Erica Pierre is getting her college degree and lives here with her daughter.
I don't want her to become an adult and live her life like this.
Last February, this property failed a federal inspection by HUD. The landlord was supposed to make repairs, but in the months since, the city of Hartford has found dozens more violations. Yet every month, a check for $1,120 for each 3-bedroom unit, most of it paid by U.S. taxpayers, goes to a company run by this man, Eli Fish. In the past 2 years, nearly $1.5 million. The problem is nationwide and growing. NBC News analysis of HUD records has found more than 1,000 properties currently with failing grades. That's more than 40,000 families living in substandard conditions. And then there are properties like this one, which passed HUD inspection, even though it was infested with mice. Resident Terry Morrison says her landlord never made the repairs, and instead of taking action, HUD kept giving him more time.
And then after that, then we give him an extension.
And then another extension.
Exactly, and then his lawyers will get involved, and then there'll be another extension.
And that's how the months start to build up.
Pile up to years.
After a year and a half of persistent problems and pressure from tenants, HUD finally canceled the contract. When residents at this Hartford building complained about holes in the ceilings, HUD officials agreed to meet, then vented their own frustrations. The tenants recorded it.
The system is broken. We just don't have the staff for it.
There's 432 properties in Connecticut alone. Yeah, okay. I have 5 staff.
Under Housing Secretary Ben Carson, HUD has shed more than 480 staff out of 8,000.
There's no accountability in the process.
Local activists say HUD does not have a firm grip on what's happening on the ground.
For an unethical landlord, this is a boondoggle. You're going to get that check every month, and HUD's not there to stop you.
It's not only possible, but it's considered legal and passable and acceptable by HUD.
So what do landlords like Eli Fish have to say?
Mr. Fish, I'm with NBC News. Can I talk to you about the,
Not right now.
the position of the infill?
I'm going to call you later, okay?
I've been trying to get in touch with you for quite some time, and I know you said you were going to call me back.
Secretary,
I want to want to stop right there because I don't want to take all of the time because there's some great information that's going to come from Sarah and Nick. But I wanted to share that with you because when you ask what have we been working on, we started with one property that turned into several properties that where people were living in deplorable conditions, right? And these folks, you know, when you think of a mom, most of them are, you know, single moms with children, women of color with children living in these properties. And the multifamily units in which they were living in had about 3 to 4 bedrooms, which accommodated their family size, but also had these pre-existing conditions. And when we looked at this, we realized that parents were making choices to live in deplorable conditions because there was no place else to go. There was no place else to go. But we also realized that the landlord was still receiving funds and money to keep the buildings. And so the residents got together, said they had enough, and they continued to push this fight as far as they can push it. Obviously, it made national news. The No More Slumlord campaign, you know, is an amazing movement because it gives people capacity to fight for their own issues. But when we realized that once HUD canceled the contracts for the buildings, now residents needed places to go. So now here we are, we have 300 families and we need to relocate them to spaces. You know, a lot of families said, I love Hartford, I want to stay in Hartford. We can help you do that. But a majority of the families said, you know, we want to try in other places. Our kids are being bused out to Glastonbury. Our kids are being bused out to Avon. Our kids are being bused out to surrounding towns. It'll be better if I can have my family just be where their school is. But what we realized as we were going through the relocation effort of trying to relocate all of these families is that the towns surrounding Hartford were not prepared for residents of color to be in their town, right? And we found that racism existed, not like, you know, not to be raw, but, you know, racism isn't a person in a white hood anymore riding around in dark with burning crosses. That's not what it is anymore. What we learned is that racism is how people check credit scores, how people, before you even make the phone call or go to the place to visit, they're already being turned away. Or you go there to see the property and the owner of the property sees that you have children and you're a person of color, and then they begin to find excuses not to give you housing. And so what we've learned is that Connecticut is a very, very blue state, but has a very, very red heart, right? Connecticut is very, very liberal, but really, really still conservative in a lot of different ways. And so a lot of the people who wanted to go other places, other towns, Avon, Glastonbury, Simsbury, Bloomfield, all the surrounding towns around Hartford did not get the opportunity because there is a level of racism still prevalent. But not only that, right? Racism is one thing to say, but what we also learned is that Hartford, Bridgeport, New Haven, Waterbury carry the brunt of multifamily units in the state of Connecticut. So when people ask, well, why doesn't Bridgeport get their act together? Why doesn't Hartford get their act together? Well, I don't see any other town that has as many multifamily units in it to have these issues. We realize that the bulk of HUD's multifamily units are in cities that have the most trouble. And so we're asking ourselves, well, how do we fix it? Well, obviously, once we got to the point of realizing that this was unfair and unequitable, most of the families had to move into worse conditions because there was not space around. And so when we have this conversation of how do we move forward, we have to understand and recognize that racism is still an issue in our society. I'm going to say it again. Racism is still an issue in our society. As it was in 1960, So it is in 2021. And so when we think of families moving and the No More Slumlord campaign, there's still a lot of work that needs to be done. So shout out to Sarah Bronin, shout out to OC, shout out to anybody that's doing the zoning work, because that's the work that needs to happen. Not saying that we don't love our spaces. Hartford is a great space, right? I see my good friend Janice Fleming on here, and she would call me every day and says, we love our space. We don't always want to move to a white town to have a Whole Foods, right? We don't always want to go visit other people's parks. We want to develop our space, but for the people who do want to move, these towns need to be set up for people of color. I'll share one more story and I'll be done. I'm a product of Rocky Hill, Connecticut. Okay, when we moved here from New York, my dad made the decision to move to Rocky Hill, Connecticut. He thought it would be a better place to raise our sons. He'll pastor in Hartford. His family will live in Rocky Hill. Well, what we didn't know, both my parents are educated, doctors, have doctorate degrees. What we didn't know is that Rocky Hill, back in the early, late 90s, was not set up to have Black children or Black families be involved in their community. As I went to school, I realized that I didn't learn as quick as white students, says my teachers. What I've learned is that when things started happening on our apartment complex, right? Century Hills, used to be called Century Hills. I don't know what it's called now. We were the first few Black families to move in. But when stuff started to get broken, guess who did it? Had to be the Black children that lived there who did it. So we got illegally evicted out of our luxurious apartment in Rocky Hill. What I learned is just because being a person of color, just because you have the education, does not, and you move to white spaces, it does not mean that you're accepted in those white spaces. So we have a lot of work to do in terms of race and equity and how that works. And so the work that Sarah Bronin is doing is something that is valuable because it allows people to have a choice where they live. So I'll end right there. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, AJ, for just setting the stage and sharing not only your story, but the stories of a lot of the residents that you work with that have been put in these impossible situations with people profiting off of their misery. And your story and your situation is something that's happening multiplied times hundreds, right? And I think it's a good segue to really talk about the Desegregate Coalition and understand, the light that Sarah Bronin and her team, Nick, have sought to shine on the ways that land use and zoning throughout the state has influenced the conditions that Pastor Johnson just spoke about in Hartford. And I do want Sarah to talk a little bit about what is zoning and how has it created this concentration of poverty in our cities, hoping that you might be able to give us sort of a crash course on zoning and its impact on housing equity.
Sure. So zoning is the regulation of land uses, structures, and lots. And it really dictates everything that is built in Connecticut. So through our research, we found that every inch of Connecticut is subject to zoning. Even those two towns that say they don't have zoning, that's Bethlehem and Eastford, they have subdivision regulations that function as zoning. So what we've done in thinking about zoning, I mean, lots of people say, oh, zoning, which it is, it's a very complex technical topic. It's very difficult for people to understand or really grasp. And for that reason, for much of our modern history, zoning has been one of those regulatory areas that has been administered by a few people who stay on zoning commissions for decades sometimes, but it hasn't been refreshed. It hasn't been viewed with a fresh eye. So one of the things our coalition has been striving to do is to get everybody, at least on the same page that zoning is important, because until people understand that zoning is important, they will not get involved in it. So again, we've built on efforts from members of our coalition and other nonprofit entities around the state who have started to raise these issues, and some of them are working in housing for decades. But we've really said, let's put an engagement and advocacy and really almost a political campaign type focus to this question. So with that in mind, I wanted to turn to our research just to show folks a little bit about our region. So here you see Hartford in the middle of our region and surrounding towns. This is not an exact proxy for the Hartford Foundation, but it's hopefully, hopefully, because we don't have the town boundaries in the zoning atlas, but hopefully it gives you a sense. This atlas is available online at actually, maybe someone can put in the chat the page for the atlas. But what this shows right now, anything that's in purple shows that that is the value that's portrayed on the screen. So for example, here we see this is where single family housing is allowed in our region. If you look at the minimum lot size for this housing, let's just go with this. There's not a minimum lot size within Hartford. That is a technical tool that is used in zoning to help drive up prices and to help kind of lock out people who may want to live on smaller lots. So you don't see that here. If you look, even if you kind of take off this is where you see half acre or more zoning. We found that across the state that 80% of the state has 1 acre minimum zoning, which in many scholars' minds is absolutely crazy for single family housing. Now I want to show you a map, and you can see what I'm clicking on the left here, hopefully, for family housing. And here you see where for family housing is allowed. It's allowed in New Britain as of right. It's allowed in Hartford as of right. So going back to what Pastor Johnson was saying about the fact that zoning has a tie and it sort of dictates opportunities. Again, I also live in Hartford. I would not live anywhere else in Connecticut than Hartford. But some people may want to live in other places. And if you're looking for multifamily housing, you'll only find it in a couple of places here. Statewide, you can, if you zoom out, you would see that 2.2% of the state is zoned for family housing, whereas for one family housing, 92% of the state is zoned for single family housing, again, predominantly on very large lots. In addition to the restriction on minimum lot size, there are other restrictions like public hearing requirements, like owner occupancy requirements, and so on that we documented across the state. So I should have said at the beginning, this zoning atlas is the first time researchers have put together all of the zoning districts in a single state and all of their housing characteristics. So if you have a chance to go to that atlas, you won't just see the number of units, you'll see the minimum lot size, you'll see which towns allow accessory dwelling units, you'll see where train stations are located and how poorly we zone around those, and some occupancy requirements. But I encourage you to explore that tool because, again, what it shows is that Pastor Johnson and other advocates that have been looking at these issues for years were not exaggerating when they said that Connecticut has different schemes for cities, different schemes for low-income areas than other areas. And the question is why? And is it helping us or is it hurting us? Other research that's collected on our website shows that this disparity in zoning hurts us as a state. Even people in wealthy areas who think that, nothing to see here, everything is fine. It's hurting them. It's hurting their kids too, because their kids are not growing up in diverse environments. So, our group says zoning, it's been studied to death. It is, in our opinion, low-hanging fruit. There are a few things we can do. We've started this session. We'll talk about that in a moment. But there are a few things we can do to really change things. And we know the consequences of changes in zoning. That's why zoning is one of the best things that we can do to quickly change the trajectory of a place.
Thank you, Sarah. And I think the point that this hurts all of us is a critical one to make. And I know I've been struck by studies that show that Suburban towns that have more diverse housing do better in recessions. So having a diverse housing is important. It's not just a moral issue, it is a moral issue, but it ultimately is better for all of us to have diverse housing choices in a variety of communities. So thank you for sharing the Zoning Atlas, which is an exciting tool. I want to go back to Pastor Johnson for a little bit to talk a little bit about resident organizing. And as we want to get to solutions, we know that research, education, and legislative advocacy are all critical, but your work lifting up the voices of residents and tying that to policy, as you've talked about, is also critically important. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the role you see community organizing playing in moving us to action, and what we here on this Zoom call could be doing to support greater capacity in community organizing.
Yes, Erica, thank you for that. And thank you, Sarah, for validating the work of organizers, right? When you are a community organizer in a small space, organizing could be looked at as agitating, right? But agitating is good. And so when we think of what can be done from a resident perspective, well, I think that we have to have the view of the resident. You need to have a whole picture, right? And, a lot of people during the No More Slumlord campaign are asking, why don't those people just move, right? That is like the whitest thing to say, because clearly you don't understand the pre-existing conditions that a lot of our people are dealing with, right? We think about our region, right? I always pick on Fairfield County, right? There's I forgot the town, but their median income is $281,000, right? The least person in that town, right, according to that study, is like 281 or 18. I might get the 1 and the 8 mixed up, but nevertheless, it is a very, very high number, right, to have a community. But then when you think of spaces like Hartford, right, where the median income is about $14,000, it may have gone up, there's like a huge disparity on what you can rent and what you can buy, right? There is a huge disparity. So when you tell someone, and most of the property, like take Emmanuel Koo, who is out of New York, who owned about 33% of the public housing stock in North Hartford, in Clay Arsenal, those folks, about 300 families, those folks just couldn't get up and move, right? Because where were they going to go? The next place out of affordable housing in a space like Hartford is the shelter, right? The next space out of affordable housing is someone's couch, right? And now you add kids into it, right? And for those who have kids on the line, you want your kids to go and be educated. You don't want to keep moving them places. So a lot of people had to make the harsh decision to live under these conditions because that was the best choice for them at that moment. And so when you have folks that are listening to the story, the news reports, or hearing the stories, asking themselves, why don't they just move, is not as easy as you would think it to be. But as we head towards solutions in community organizing, I think and this is just me, I think community organizing is the key to giving capacity to people, to residents, to the people that we serve, the people that we're talking about, right? Because we have a lot of conversations without involving the people that are affected in the conversation. But in my experience is, if you give the mom who has 2 kids, who has to work 2-3 jobs, the capacity to know what power is, right? Power is the ability to act. That's what we teach. Power is not mystical. Power isn't the mayor. Power isn't the governor. Power isn't the board of ed. Power is simply the ability to act and how you use it. But then we also go through with the residents, not only what power is, and we also explain power in this country comes in 2 forms: organized money and organized people, right? So, but then when you have a resident who does not have time to show up to school board meetings, doesn't have time or capacity to go visit her management office at her apartment because she's getting off work at 7, you know, and they close at 4, and she doesn't even have the opportunity to share her, she's just living in it, right? But once you give residents capacity to know what power is, to understand power, and to organize their voices amongst themselves, that's when change happens. The thing that I'm most proud of, and shout out to Sarah Bronin, got a lot of respect for her, is when we wanted to change the housing code, because we realized the housing code was, one, it was a 42-year-old document, but 2, we realized that a lot of the changes that we wanted in the city when it pertains to tenants and landlords was based in the housing code. And so the residents went through the housing code and submitted it to council. Council approved it, and it got done, right? But that would have never happened if there wasn't resident participation in that conversation, and picking times that work for them to be a part of those conversations. So as we head to solutions, if I'm sitting here and I have the Hartford Foundation, in my mind has $1 billion to give throughout the region. I'm not sure if they have $1 billion, but it feels like they got $1 billion to give, right? Hopefully they do. Give me a couple bucks, right? I would say if you really want resident participation, I think creating opportunities for residents to take off work to fight for themselves is the best option you can give a lot of them, right? Because a lot of them are working. Don't believe what you hear in the news that folks are sitting at home collecting $600 checks. Don't believe that. Some are, but the majority are going to work for fast food restaurants. The majority are working with senior citizens in convalescent homes. The majority are hardworking people that do a lot to maintain just a simple, regular day life. But if you give them the capacity to fight for themselves in a meaningful way, that's when things get done. Not only fight for themselves, but bring other people along, right? The final thing that we share in community organizing that I think makes it work is the difference between problems and issues, okay? Like, problems is stuff that you can't do anything about. It's just gonna be there, whether, you know, when you're going home to glory, bless God, right? When you're going on home, these problems are still gonna be there. But if we could break housing down and housing problems down into issues, then we have something actionable. Then we have something we can talk to Ms. Rothstein about. Then we have things that we can talk to Mayor Bronin about. Then we have things that we can talk to license and inspections about. But if we continue allowing people to feel like they don't have capacity, we will always have the issues that we have. And so the foundation, if there's any goodwill, maybe they'll pay me for this, right? As a consultant fee, right? Pay me today. If there's anything, allow residents and people to have capacity over their own situations.
Thank you, Pastor. I love that. And I think at least in our own programmatic work, we have been finding ways to compensate residents for the expertise that they bring to our work as a matter of practice. And I think it's something that we should be continuing and doing more of. But I think your words about the power of the unified voice of residents when given that opportunity and when enabled to have that capacity is incredible. And I want to turn now back to our colleagues at Desegregate Connecticut and Nick Abbott, and really sort of talk about the unique situation we found ourselves in last summer, where folks were much more willing to really have real conversations about systemic racism. We were faced with the murder of George Floyd. People in suburban communities were more active in listening and hearing the real impacts of structural racism on their neighbors, some perpetuated by their own town's zoning codes. And so this session raised a unique opportunity to educate folks about the need for zoning reform, a unique opportunity to build a coalition and to make some policy changes. So hoping you could talk a little bit about the Desegregate Coalition's legislative accomplishments during this session.
Absolutely. Yeah. As you said, our group really recognized and was fueled by a broader recognition throughout our state of the need to attack some of the sources of structural and institutional racism, of which housing is one of the foremost. And starting last summer, we started working with a coalition of partners to put together a legislative platform to figure out what we could do at the state level to make advancements on some of the issues that Sarah and Pastor AJ have been talking about, in particular as it relates to zoning. So what we did during that time last summer is we reached out to a lot of different groups from throughout the state: social justice groups, advocacy groups, professional planners, land use lawyers, economic groups, labor groups, and get as much input as we could to try and develop a coalition consensus-based approach to this issue. We knew that both that would be a strength for developing the best policies possible that serve the interests of our state, but also is the best political approach possible, that if we got everybody in the room and on the same page and mobilizing behind an agenda, that we could achieve some real change in the state. So our initial proposals, we had tons of things that we were throwing all into one bill, and eventually whittled that down to around a set of 10 proposals that we had in our original draft legislation, which was first introduced in the state Senate early on in the legislative session in February or March, I believe. And that incorporated a few things that I'll go through. So that incorporated, well, first I'll go through the things that made it into the final bill and ended up passing into law, which we're very excited about. So first was around accessory dwelling units. That was a term that Sarah used earlier that some people here may be familiar with. That might be an unfamiliar kind of technical term to others, but what an accessory dwelling unit or an ADU is, it's essentially a smaller housing unit that's secondary to the main home on a given parcel or lot of land. And these can be built, attached or detached, often from a single family home. Following college, I actually lived in an accessory dwelling unit and otherwise would not have been able to afford where I lived, if not for this kind of low cost option, which provided both, they're cheap to build. It gives single family or multifamily homeowners the chance to earn extra revenue and to support themselves and to pay off their mortgage and housing costs. So it really is kind of a win-win situation and something that we saw that a lot of communities were really eager to allow. Unfortunately, though, while a lot of towns formally allowed these sorts of units, around half of towns in Connecticut allowed them as of right, that is without a special permit, the requirements were very onerous in ways that meant that none actually got built. The size requirements were too small. They banned renters or people who weren't elderly. And so by setting uniform guidelines throughout the state about what every town would have to allow for these units, certain size requirements, for example, and saying that they have to allow people to rent them out, we're really hopeful that that's going to lead to a proliferation of those sorts of units, not just in places that have traditionally had them, but in some of the wealthier towns throughout our state where there are precious few housing options for particularly for people with lower incomes or younger people or even seniors who are looking to downsize. So that was one piece, and that actually made it into the final bill and passed, which we're very excited about. Another piece that was in the bill that passed was around parking reform. So as part of the Zoning Atlas project, one of the pieces of information we collected was around parking minimum requirements. And so what these requirements consist of is lots of towns, when a new development is being proposed or built, require the developer of new housing to build a certain number of parking spaces for every unit of housing. Hartford, under Sarah's leadership, actually got rid of parking minimums, and that's not what our bill did, but it still capped the amount that towns could require new developments to include. Because what we know is that when towns require new builders to build, as some towns in Connecticut require, 3 parking spaces for every studio apartment or 1-bedroom apartment, that's producing far more parking than we need, number one. And number two, it's adding a lot of cost to the new housing. It costs tens of thousands of dollars to build each new parking space, when that space could be put to use as open space or building more land. And so it had both an environmental impact, subsidizing also car infrastructure, and also this affordability impact in deterring development or adding to the cost of new housing. So by capping those requirements, in our bill, it caps it at 1 space is allowed. Towns can require 1 space for studio or 1-bedroom apartments, or 2 spaces for 2-bedroom apartments. That kind of sets a modest cap that gets rid of, actually, in a lot of towns, requirements that are above that threshold. A few other things that made it into the final bill that we're very excited about is a new requirement that all towns' zoning codes affirmatively further fair housing. This is a term you might be familiar with at the federal level from the Federal Fair Housing Act, but one that, under the Trump administration was the rule around that requirement was withdrawn. We've seen precious little federal enforcement of that law. And unfortunately, there's no private right of action. So only the federal government can enforce the requirement that towns, or as is the case at the federal level, recipients of federal grants, affirmatively further fair housing. And so by getting this requirement into state law, it adds a lot more teeth to make sure that all towns that enact zoning codes and enforce those codes affirmatively further fair housing, which means that they're not just refraining from discriminating, which we know is important, but they're actively doing something to provide for more housing opportunities in their town, since we're really starting from way before the starting line when it comes to providing equitable housing opportunities in Connecticut. Another thing in the final bill was eliminating of the character requirement. So under the State Zoning Enabling Act, which is what gives towns the power to enact and enforce their zoning codes, the state actually required towns to consider the character of their communities. And while we know that sometimes character refers to the physical environment, all too often that character can often refer to the people that are associated with certain types of dwellings. So by eliminating that character requirement, as well as some other kind of pernicious language that was skewed against allowing for multifamily housing to a more objective set of criteria, we're not only providing for better land use planning, but also hopefully more equitable land use planning as well. There are a few other things, and I see that Sarah has left in the chat a more detailed summary for those of you who are into the policy details and the wonkery around this stuff. But it's safe to say there's a lot of good stuff that was in that bill, and we think it's a great first step. That being said, as I think we'll talk about in a moment, there was plenty of stuff that wasn't in the final bill. And that's the nature of the legislative process, but something that we're going to be fighting for going forward around requiring towns to allow more housing around transit or around their downtowns in particular, that we know is particularly important to really force towns to all do their part. None of our proposals were substantially withdrawing most of local control from communities. But we do think there is the need for a stronger hand from the state to force all towns and all communities, particularly those where economic opportunity is concentrated, where there are higher median incomes, and that have access to our precious, whether it's our coastal resources or our high-speed transportation. We know that there's a stronger need for the state to step in and require those communities to do their part to house Connecticut, both in terms of total housing supply and a greater diversity of housing. So that's kind of where we are right now and where we're looking to go moving forward.
That's great. Thank you so much, Nick, for the overview. And I think, there's a lot of detail here. There's a lot of terminology that a lot of us aren't familiar with in our day-to-day life. And I think, taking a look at the Desegregate Connecticut website and the various webinars that the team has done, certainly I've learned a lot. But part of the work that we've done with Desegregate Connecticut is zoning boot camps to teach residents really how to understand their own town's zoning codes. So appreciate you giving us some additional information as well. So we're about to jump over to our questions from our Catalyst members, but before we do, just wanted to give space for any of the panelists to talk about, what's your priority for, you've talked about your current work, but what's your priority as far as next steps? Are there things that you're just itching to get on as far as your next activities in this area?
Actually, I'll pick up on the zoning boot camp that you just mentioned. So that, for those who may have not gotten a report about it yet, it was an exercise to try to help Hartford residents and regional residents. It was half and half, to understand what zoning is, what it does, and really just at a very basic level, how they could engage in the zoning process. We weren't trying to get them to advocate at the state level, but really just get a baseline understanding and see whether the workshop would be a good model for other communities. So our hope going forward is to use that as really the core strategy for moving more zoning reforms forward, not just at the state level, but also at the local level. So we thought that that was a really great pilot. As far as I know, it's never been done in the country. We paid participants, Hartford Foundation enabled the payment of participants for their time, which goes back to Pastor Johnson's comment of, you're getting something, we're all in this together. So we compensate people for their time. I really believe in that. So that's one aspect that I hope to expand in the coming year or two. But we really need, beyond me and our student core volunteers, we do need a full-time staff person or somebody who can spearhead that. So we're looking to ramp up our organizational capacity as well. That said, we also are looking at this much bigger picture of education. What do we know that can help people make better decisions in their own communities, whether they're people who want to influence the zoning process or people who want to become planning and zoning commissioners? So we want to kind of, depending on the spectrum of interest, we want to be able to be a resource to help people engage. And that is really what I think engage and be educated is really what the next phase of our work is going to focus on, because we found with 70 op-eds written in favor of zoning reform, with these organizations that have come to us to really start participating, learning, and engaging and bringing it back to their own advocacy communities, we found that that was really effective in sort of a community awareness. That is what pushed these reforms through the legislature. Once you realize how bad it is, then you're like, oh man, I really want to change it. So we want to help people see, look, this is not great. We've done some stuff this year. We're going to do more next year. And Nick previewed some of that, talking about transit-oriented development, looking at minimum lot sizes, some of these other more specific strategies we can pursue statewide. But people also need to show up to zoning commission meetings to speak in favor of new housing. And that's really what we hope to be able to empower people to do through our next phase.
Pastor, any last thoughts before we open it up to questions? What's next? What's on your highest priority list?
Right. So I want to support what I heard earlier in the Desegregate conversation that they had. If you ever want to see what housing or what zoning committees look like, research the Haddam Zoning Commission in the meeting that they had maybe about a year or two ago, and just listen. It's on YouTube. Just listen to it, and it'll be very, very clear on why we're all fighting for this. Because it just, like I said, it just can't be, Hartford, Bridgeport, New Haven, like all these smaller towns that have multi-family units fighting for equity. This has to be a statewide push, and I think it does start. I think they are accurate when it comes to the planning and zoning members that are on those town boards. I mean, it's some of the stuff is disgusting, the way people still think today when it comes to people of color moving into their towns. So as an organization, Center for Leadership and Justice and the Greater Hartford Interfaith Action Alliance, we are actually, there's a few things that we're working on and two of them that I'm really, really proud of. One, out of the housing issue that we talked about, we realized that when we were moving residents of Barber Gardens out and that they were preparing a class action lawsuit against the landlord, the state of Connecticut jumped in and said, hey, well, before, I don't know how they heard of it. I don't, like, state of Connecticut moves and ways that they want to move when it comes to certain particular things. But they sent a few of our residents a letter stating that we hear that there's a lawsuit about to happen. You're gonna owe us, this amount of money because we helped you, back in '92 with an asthma pump or with cash assist or whatever. And so one thing that I'm proud of, which was the first bill out of the state capitol this year, is welfare liens, the repealing of welfare liens. Connecticut and New York were the only two states that had this egregious thing where we help you, but you're gonna owe us, you'll owe us later. And so obviously there's still more work to be done on that bill. As Nick said, the thing I hate about the like I'm losing hair on top of my head due to this legislative process, because you think you get one thing, but once it goes through the ringers, right, you end up with some watered down legislation that you didn't really want, but you're kind of forced to be like, all right, whatever. Hopefully we'll do better with that and how we engage legislators and that dialogue that happens for what, the original intention of something was and what you really get. But I'm proud of the welfare liens bill because, one, it repealed it in our state, and it's getting New York to do the same thing in their legislative session as well. So that's one thing that we are working on that came out of the No More Slumlords campaign. The other thing that I'm proud of that we are working on is declaring racism a public health crisis. And I can go all day on what that looks like, but I am proud of the step that we took along with our partners, Health Equity Solution, Power Up CT, the YWCA, and a few other organizations that charge it to my head and not my heart. For those that are watching that know that took on the fight to make that strong declaration, but also have a commission come together to give recommendations about what equity looks like in the state. Very proud of that. I think that's a very, very good start to having this conversation. It's not the end, it is at the very beginning of it. But as for us, we are still going to continue to engage residents. We are still fielding phone calls from the pandemic from residents that are having housing conditions. And so that's what we'll be working on. But the final thing that I want to say to you all is, from what you heard today, what personal changes are you going to make in your life? That is the question that I think everyone should leave here with. You've heard the information in the demographics from Desegregate Connecticut. You've heard what's happening on the ground. As an individual in the towns that you live in, what change, what is prompting you to change? What's inside of you at this moment that's calling you to do something about it? I think that's where change starts, in our own communities, having these conversations of why you're willing to change. So thank you.
Thank you, Pastor, and thank you to all of our panelists, Nick and Sarah. I really appreciate it. And now I'm gonna push this over to my colleague Betty Ann, who I think will facilitate a few questions from Catalyst members.
Yes, I want to thank the panelists. I hated to cut that conversation off because it was so rich and so much good information, but I know we have members that have questions too. So I want to invite our members and guests to either put questions in the chat or, turn your camera on, wave your hand. I'll be on the lookout for you. There may also be people that have not just a question, but a comment or a thought or an experience that they've had themselves that they would like to share with the group. So I invite that too. I did have one question through the chat that we'll start out with. There are so many apartment units being added to the Hartford area, but most of them are studio and one-bedroom apartments, clearly not adequate for families. And how can this be changed to open up family-size units for people that are living in substandard housing? Can either of you address that?
Yeah, Nick, feel free to chime in with anything I forget, but actually we think some of the legislation that was just passed can help with that. First of all, and cities that are now municipalities are subject to this affirmatively further fair housing requirement. We think that what that really means is that towns have to zone and sort of diversify their housing stock in a way that enables a variety of people to live there. It's the first time that zoning regulations have been subject to that. And so we think that that will help to pave the way for more diverse housing, including through number of bedrooms. We also know, we've collected research on our website, and I can drop a link to the FAQ in the chat, showing that multifamily housing actually brings revenues to towns. So this old argument that if we have multifamily housing and kids come, what's going to happen? Well, I mean, for the most part, we've seen that apartment buildings actually more than offset any costs that they impose on the town and costs that they impose on the school system. Besides which, if you're building single family housing, no one ever asks, what are we going to do with these kids who are coming into our neighborhoods? So we hope that, again, part of what we want to do is to change the conversation to say, Connecticut is losing people. We're an aging state. That again, even if you care nothing about equity, that's bad for our economy. It's bad for our state's overall trajectory. We actually need more families to come here. We need more kids. We need to build a kid-friendly society. And there's a whole host of other issues that go with that, like providing daycare and other services. But Nick, I'll throw it over to you if you have anything else to add.
I think that really covered most of it. The only thing I'd add is, what we found in our research is that I think somewhere around 130 plus of our 169 school districts have declining enrollment. So a talking point we'd hear over and over again is towns, they're worried that if they build more housing, they'll have more kids coming in and more expenditures on schools. But we know that towns are actually declining in enrollment. Actually, we need a lot more kids in our state. Both for fiscal reasons, but also just to keep our state growing and dynamic and be a place where families want to be, and developing the sorts of housing that's appealing to families, but that's also affordable to families, is tremendously important throughout the Hartford region and throughout the state. On the affordable housing side, there's a great piece that Jacqueline Robb Thomas, the Connecticut Mirror, she's now with WNPR, but I think her last piece at the Mirror covered this issue well around making sure that our affordable housing isn't just for elderly housing, which is important, but that towns are building affordable housing for families as well. And there's a variety of legal measures that, as Sarah mentioned, I think the new changes to state law will help buttress to make sure that towns are doing their part on the legal, stick side, but also on the convincing side. I think our group and groups like Pastor Johnson's are necessary to help push the message forwards that towns are willingly doing it too, in addition to having the legal motivation to do it.
Thank you all. Yes, that's the issue of family housing is sort of a big issue into itself, I know. I see Janice, you have your hand up, so I want to call on you and welcome you to the program. Just unmute. Great.
Thank you very much for having me. I'm sorry that I'm so informal. I was engaging in trying to work out and then seeing AJ poster. And this is an issue that I'm extremely passionate about for many of the things that AJ laid out in his testimony. And I want to add, before I add my question, that, to Sarah's credit, I have never met a zoning chair who have participated in the communities and her way of educating people on zoning. And so to that, I think it is beautiful, especially coming from a woman of color. However, I have a lot of concerns about what was said here today. Like Ms. Franks was able to highlight when Sarah was talking, how this would benefit suburban communities. And I continue to follow this theme and this line about how this benefits suburban communities. I'm a taxpayer here. I pay home taxes, car taxes, and there's several other Black and brown people who pay taxes, who live here. And it is really troublesome to me that there are so many brilliant minds and there's so much will from the foundation, and we can't figure out how to keep people in their communities. The option of having one, I don't have a problem with that, but it feels very like Chef versus O'Neill sometime, and that don't always work out for our children when we go on in the suburbs. AJ talked about racism, and therefore it can't be thought about in an abstract, like we're going to just deal with desegregating housing and not realize that you're bringing Black and brown people in communities where they're not wanted. And somehow some of us are supposed to be the crash dummies for that exercise.
Janice, I appreciate.
We're not just moving to the suburbs because we want to. We're moving to the suburbs because we want to educate our children. We want our children to play outside safely. And oftentimes that is not possible in urban communities. So while I appreciate the efforts, I really want to hear more people talking about how this benefits urban communities in this broader context. What are you going to do to make sure when Black and brown people go to these racist communities that they're safe? Because they can't be a part of a community that's racist. All you asking them to do at that point is exist in that community, to just reside there, to have their zip code. I need people to think critically about what this means for Black and brown people at this time in history. But I want to thank Sarah for her efforts. I want to thank AJ for his work. He and I debate this issue. He knows the areas in which I agree. He knows the areas in which I disagree with him in this matter. But I want to be able to say what Ms. Frank said when she was in this conversation and was able to say how this benefits suburban communities. I want to understand how all of this benefit urban taxpayers. Thank you so much, you guys. I appreciate it.
Janice, thank you for sharing your thoughts. We really appreciate hearing from you and hearing your experience. It's, I think, you know, you touched on something that we've talked about a lot too. It's not just a Hartford issue. It's a Hartford issue. It's a suburban issue. It's a state issue. Now, of course, the challenges are different in different places, but it's not just about Hartford. I mean, sometimes the challenges could be seen as even greater in the suburbs that are not welcoming and are not don't have housing to allow people to make choices to live in those communities. Maybe that's the real problem. So there's a lot to go around.
I'd like to address one thing. Oh, go ahead.
I'm not here to, I'm really speaking about self-interest and my people, the people I serve, the things I hear, some of the challenges we have with zoning in our communities now while developing things. I'm speaking from people that are, you know, Sarah, this isn't just me speaking, this is being thought out amongst a group of women, you know, and having these conversations. And so I think it's as a taxpayer and several other taxpayers that I'm talking to who have self-interest, we're really interested in Hartford. It's not that we're not interested in other places, but I'm interested in where I pay my tax dollars and how are they working for me and what resources, if I'm giving some to a foundation or whatever, what is that? How is that benefiting me and my community? So everyone's going to be thinking about this in terms of self-interest. All of us, this is why you're getting the pushback from the suburbs, because everyone's thinking about their self-interest.
Yeah, I was actually going to, I appreciate that comment, and it's certainly not the first time that we've heard it. And I actually wanted to show you something on the zoning atlas that might be relevant. One of the things that we push for at the state level was this accessory dwelling units, which Nick talked about. I want to show you that actually, so accessory dwelling units enable homeowners to create a unit in their property that that they can then use to increase their equity. They can create another unit of housing. They can have a multi-generational situation. The main places where accessory dwelling units are prohibited are cities. Hartford is the only city, whoops, my thing is going wild, that actually allows accessory dwelling units the way that we do. If you look, Stamford bans them, Danbury bans them, Waterbury bans them, New Haven mostly bans them, and Bridgeport bans them. So what you actually see, and then other suburbs do too, but what you actually really see is that what we've done with ADUs is we've said in the suburbs, you guys can build, these things and capture the value of their homes. In the cities where Black and brown homeowners tend to concentrate for reasons we've discussed, they're not able to. So interestingly, the ADU enabling legislation will actually benefit Black and brown communities disproportionately, because at this point, even if they're restricted somewhat in the suburbs, they're not allowed at all in the cities. So that's one thing. Another thing too, though, is that if you look at Connecticut right now, you see that there is a huge surge in prices. And you ask, well, why is this? The reason that is because there's not enough housing being built. Across the state, we don't have enough housing that's being built. So whether you want to buy a house in Bridgeport or Hartford, you want to buy a house in the suburbs, they're becoming increasingly unaffordable. And again, this is Econ 101, where you have a limited supply because we're not building enough housing units, and thus you have rising prices. So across the board, again, this is based in research, the more housing a community, a town, a city, a state, a region builds, the lower the prices, the lower the barriers to entry, the lower prices are for first-time home buyers, for families, for seniors wanting to downsize. So that too, we are such a high-cost state that burden disproportionately falls on families of color. And so again, we hope we have been asked this question before, and it's a really important point. But if you start getting down into the nitty-gritty, you see that some of these policies that we're hoping to change, they sound technical, but overall we're hoping to raise the ability of people to again become homeowners in cities and in towns, and also to capture the value of their properties once they are in that situation.
I don't want to take up any more time because I think this is an important conversation and I want others to engage in it. But I do think that I really would hope that beyond Sarah, that others would really take seriously what it means to zone and develop in communities and make housing a part of a neighborhood. Like, neighborhood zoning is critical within this conversation and how that plays out in urban communities. So I hope that you guys will continue to dig deeper and continue to ask yourself critical questions that make it more equitable for everyone. Have a wonderful evening.
Janice, that's a great kind of wrap. I'm sorry that we're running out of time for questions, but I think that's a good summary that we're all called to action here. Part of our mission this evening was to educate ourselves, and I think we have learned a lot from our presenters and from everyone. And I guess I want to say thank you first to our presenters for even being willing to be here tonight and to share your knowledge and your work, because there's a lot to learn, and I know this is just the tip of the iceberg. I want to remind the group, though, that at our core, the Catalyst Endowment Fund is a giving circle, and we can't do our work without generous donors like you. So we hope for those of you that aren't already a Catalyst member this year that you will join Catalyst Endowment Fund this year. You can go to hfpg.org/catalyst and learn all about the giving circle and click on the link to donate. It's a $250 donation the first year, and we hope you will be a part of this. We welcome guests to these educational forums, but for the grant making process in the fall, that will be for members only. So we hope you'll want to be a part of that too. As Terry said, the fund has built up over the years. We're very grateful to our generous donors. And because of that, we have $60,000 to make grants with this year that will go to nonprofits in the Hartford region that are addressing this issue. So we hope you're going to want to continue to be a part of this conversation this year, and that you will join and be on board with us for the rest of the year. I also want to kind of a surprise announcement. we have the Connecticut Fair Housing Center has offered to provide a special lunch and learn webinar for us on 100 years of fair housing history. So we couldn't work that into our program, but we're going to offer it as a separate program 3 weeks from today on July 20th from 12 to 1. And I will be sending out an invitation to that. It won't be as interactive. It'll be a webinar, but they've got a lot of great history and photographs and information that talks about kind of zoning and housing history and how that's created these inequitable communities. So hope you'll be able to join in on that. Lastly, I want to thank my fellow colleagues at the Hartford Foundation. Thank you, Erica, for being a part of this panel tonight and for leading it so ably and for connecting the dots with a lot of different issues on the table. I want to thank my colleague, Michael, for putting together the whole idea and making these contacts with our presenters. I want to thank Michaela and Kayla Rose behind the scenes that are doing all the technical aspects of a successful Zoom evening. And I hope I'm not missing anybody there. Nick, thank you for joining in tonight too. But lastly, I want to introduce Jay Williams, who is the president of the Hartford Foundation for Public Giving. He had a conflict earlier and was afraid he wouldn't be with us at the very beginning of the meeting. He was, but at any rate, we saved him for last. And I want to invite Jay to give us just a few minutes now of kind of the treetops, what the Hartford Foundation is doing and how this relates to some of the work that is on your plate, Jay. So welcome.
Good evening, everyone. Betty Ann, thank you for your leadership of this endeavor, for your leadership of Catalyst. And I have to say thank you to Catalyst just for taking on this issue. As was pointed out in the beginning, Catalyst is our original giving circle, has been the longest in its inception and has not shied away from taking on issues that some might deem to be sensitive or controversial, but are absolutely necessary. I just want to say quickly, I've been involved in a number of these conversations over the course of my career, going back some 15 or 20 years. And this conversation this evening stands out as one of the most powerful and one of the most compelling, not only because of the issue that was at hand, the historical ties to the inequitable zoning and housing policies in this state, but because of the comments that were shared at the very end, that this is about housing, but this also, we have to take into the account that making housing opportunities available across our region is important, but it is still a problem if those housing opportunities are available, but the residents of color are not wanted. So there's something to be said about having housing opportunities, and we are absolutely committing ourselves to that. But it also, I think, underscores the importance of the journey that we're on to dismantle systemic racism and increase social and economic opportunities and mobility. Because to live isolated in a wonderful, bucolic community with great schools and many amenities and all the things that would seem on the surface to be what one would aspire to, but to not have the comfort and the serenity of knowing that you're welcome. That there are always going to be a handful of people anywhere and everywhere that carry a certain view of others, but to understand the importance of this is exactly what we're after. And I say that because when we talk about our efforts around high opportunity neighborhoods, that's one of the terms that we use that encompasses this type of work. That does address housing opportunities in the surrounding communities, but I also want to point out it addresses housing opportunities in Hartford. How do we work collectively to increase the opportunities of the neighborhoods within Hartford for those who are looking to do that? And one of the tools that we have at our disposal was recently announced just a few weeks ago, and that's our Action Fund for Racial Justice. And that Action Fund is a tool and a mechanism that we are using to advance all of our efforts around this dismantling of structural racism, of, again, which housing opportunities and the zoning is certainly at the core of that. We're excited about the fund's dollars being deployed to help with the urgent needs. This is a current use fund, so while we are blessed to have the endowment, which helps us on the longer term issues that we address, we have this structured as a current use fund, and we're excited about how we've been inspired by our donors and stakeholders and how we also want to be an inspiration. Donations that go into this fund will be put out into the community immediately. Again, these aren't dollars that we're going to sit on. These are dollars that are going to be deployed into the community, into supporting affordable housing and stability and community safety and so many other things. And I would invite you to learn more about our Action Fund for Racial Justice. It's on our website, hfpg.org/action fund. So that's hfpg.org/action fund. And we can drop that in the chat. You'll hear more and more about that in the coming days and weeks. It will be certainly something. I'll give you a little teaser. I hope that you are eagerly anticipating our celebration of giving, which is coming up in September. We are going to have a lot of activity around this. But thank you all for everything that you've done, to all of our speakers, the expertise and the passion that you brought. You didn't just bring expertise, you brought passion and a genuine, authentic interest in this. And to the Catalyst members, once again, I don't take for granted all that you do for us and with us. And on that note, I will say good evening and turn this back over to Betty Ann to close it out.
Well, no more closure needed. Thank you, everyone, for being with us tonight. We want to honor your time and thank you for your support of the work of the Catalyst Endowment Fund. And we appreciate every bit we can learn makes us better to address this issue. So thank you all and have a great night.